So this session will be in French, and so we will give priority to the questions you may have, because we've dealt in depth with the issues at hand, but earlier we were asked if there were more examples that we could give, and we will do so with different representatives, elected representatives, and representatives of the industry and others. And in particular, we will talk about ecological transition in the context of the IPCC report. Of course, this is significant. We have 3 years left to act and avoid the most devastating effects of climate change. And in territories, of course, there is an urgency to act, but we need to organize ourselves to plan and think about the long term. So you, managers of electricity networks, you've understood this. You are organized at European level via the ENTSO-E. And in terms of planning, you plan the connection needs for electricity grids over a horizon of 10 years. And we'll also talk about what new reflections are necessary, and particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine, and faced with the need of energy independence in Europe. We know that we need to reflect on new governance. We'll talk about this. And in terms of politicians and institutional players, we will also talk about the urgency of the situation from an ecological point of view, and how do you see things in the long term. So you're going to tell us concretely about what you do. We'll talk about your difficulties, but also some concrete examples that might well inspire other actors here. And will be from your different points of view, of course, to provide us with your points of view. What are the particular difficulties that you encounter? So we'd like to know what you do, what projects you are piloting. And also you can perhaps tell us how we can be more resilient and adapt for the long term. We need to think about the present and the long-term future. So perhaps we can start with you, President Rottner. For 2 years, you've been president of the larger cross-border region, Luxembourg, Meurthe-Moselle, Moselle, the Rhineland-Palatinate. So can you perhaps explain to us how this governance of this major region works, this cross-border region, and what have you chosen to implement during your presidency? So it would be good if you could talk to us also about hydrogen. Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. What we are missing perhaps here is the Walloon area of Belgium, the French-speaking area of Belgium. We're missing our Belgian friends perhaps here. Of course, when we talk about borders, our border up to Basel in Switzerland, the larger region beyond the departments that you've mentioned is the eastern region of France, from the Paris suburbs up to the Rhine and down to the Franche-Comté. So strategically, we are a cross-border region, the largest one in France. So we could say that we are within the heart of the European continent, and we play a significant role, a political role, which is essential in terms of cooperation that goes beyond sometimes the limits of the grouping of this larger region. The need to cooperate with the valley of the Rhine And the Upper Rhine, it is important. It is not exclusive, having said that, and we need to cooperate with other border areas in France, border areas with Belgium, such as the Hauts-de-France. Um, so it is not exclusive to us, but certainly it is a strategic element in our daily lives. And I followed your debate this morning. Uh, we have to think about the regions in terms of national strategies. We're talking about cooperations that don't necessarily go via our capitals, Paris, Berlin, or Brussels, or others. We have competence, and the lever effect means that we don't need necessarily to refer back to the center. I am the only president of regions in metropolitan France that has been given diplomatic recognition with the prefects of the region when we are dealing with our border relationships at close proximity with the other side of the border. And on the topics that you mentioned, sustainable development and very concrete elements beyond the health crisis, of course, that you also discussed. And this is important from the sense of responsibility towards the environment and social responsibility. And all of this, of course, is linked. But we wish to make sure that the French presidency of the larger region should be focused on very significant topics, for example, mobility, sustainable mobility. We are talking about an investment of 375 million euros of materials, roading materials that we have, with the opening of 7 cross-border lines that will be developed between France and Germany. And this is something we can go into detail. We're talking about water management too. Remember the floods, the catastrophic floods that happened in the Rhineland-Palatinate, in Wallonia, with joint responsibilities, upstream and downstream strategies should be reflected upon, should be identical and intelligent. And there are different ways of doing things, of course, in terms of pollution and industrial choices that need to be made. We have committed to reduce the waste represented by chlorine, so that the levels of pollution will diminish, and that water consumption should be improved, and the water quality should be improved. And on hydrogen also, this is a major issue because we have a hydrogen pipeline that could potentially come from Hamburg, another from the North Sea down to Luxembourg, that could be sold to the Saar region. And we will have an hydrogen pipeline coming from the south of France. And at the same time, we produce hydrogen with our neighbors that produce 40%, which represent their industrial needs, and so they can bring 60% of their additional production. And there are other projects, of course, smaller products, such as the production of heat on both sides of the Rhine between Strasbourg and Kiel. Well, Kiel would provide heat to Strasbourg. So all these examples are very concrete. And what is interesting too would be to understand in all these examples that you give, uh, is it very operational, or are there any obstacles? You mentioned that you have a specific diplomatic status, which is interesting to know. Does it really help you? Well, we are expecting a clear framework from Europe, from our governments. Well, clear frameworks, meaning, no, I'm talking about clear frameworks regarding these large infrastructures today. Europe needs to be able to organize, such as it did for gas. It should organize hydrogen pipelines, perhaps electricity also. We'll come back to this. And states need to define the framework from which we will be able to define a proximity strategy. We need to have a creditor, we need to have credit alliances, and we need to be operational. There are transformations happening in industry, in mobility, in railway transport or river transport for hydrogen. So there are different options. There are risks, of course, because these have not been confirmed by a legal European framework or even national framework. And then, from a diplomatic point of view, it certainly helps us to work with the state regionally and with the prefect of the region. We are sustaining a dialogue, and who is very present in the recovery plan today. And there is a need to find sufficient human resources, of course. And what is needed is to provide a capacity to provide a solution, including with our neighboring countries, so that we all speak with one voice. Because very often uh, in other areas, we're not quite sure who's speaking on behalf of whom. But as far as the Grand East region of France, then things are very clear. We know who is speaking on behalf of whom, which means that in Luxembourg and Belgium, they only have one counterpart that they need to speak to in France. And we are building together. It's not a question of on one side of the border, some people benefiting, and on the other side of the border, suffering. No. Yes, and perhaps also with Damian Cortinas, you are the administrator of ENTSO-E. You're going to tell us what this is, but what we would like to know is how this association of industrialists, you'll tell us how it operates, how does it help you to plan for the long term? Why isn't it national governments, states that negotiate these issues of the European electricity grid that go beyond the borders of the Union, in fact? So how do you deploy your activities? How do you plan? How are you planning this European electricity grid beyond borders? Well, thank you first of all for inviting me. Um, First of all, I would like to explain what is ENTSO-E, which is not an easy acronym. It just means that the managers of electricity grids in Europe have decided to combine their strengths for a very simple reason, and that is that electricity is a way of unifying countries, so we can go much further and act in a far simpler way in terms of the management of the electricity grids. And our mission is to develop the grids, but also to manage them on a daily basis. And of course, there has to be a balance at all times between consumption and production. So we've combined our efforts, and we have put in place many tools that enables us to build the electricity grids for today and tomorrow. But also we are recognized today. We are recognized by legislators. Uh, in the end, we are considered to be of public interest, and there are missions that are given to us officially via the EU. And I can give you concrete examples. This year, we managed something which was very concrete and visible, and that is the connection of the Ukrainian electricity grid to the rest of Europe. When the war started, the Ukraine was isolated because they no longer had any links with Russia, and it wasn't connected to the rest of Europe. So the Council of Ministers of Energy met and they decided that it was very important for Europe to show solidarity towards the Ukraine, and they decided to stabilize the network by connecting it to the Ukraine. And they asked us to do this, and 3 weeks later, it only took 3 weeks for the Ukraine to be connected. And this, to me, is a very good example of how industrialists, if there is a political will, this enables us to go much further in terms of cooperation. And ENTSO-E, we go beyond political borders. We say that the laws of electricity don't always follow human legislation. And we followed the example of Switzerland, Balkans, and Norway. Uh, And we have been obtained. We've been able to obtain the unanimous agreement of all European countries, including Serbia. And this happened very sort of smoothly, it seems, and it only took 3 weeks to connect to Ukraine. Uh, so many, I think, people here will be very impressed with what you've done in just over 3 weeks in a war context. So, could you tell us perhaps what are the advantages of such structures and the difficulties also that you might encounter, because you might have difficulties with strategic decisions that have to be made? Well, our main obstacles today is that there are 39 of us, because we go beyond the political borders of the EU. We cover practically the whole of Europe as a continent, 39 countries, and we all have our national, we all manage our electricity grids in a national political context with interests that are sometimes the same, sometimes not. What we can do as industrialists is that we look for solutions. At some point, we see that countries are not fully aligned in the way to solve problems. So we search for solutions that enable us to make progress, because we believe that we will be stronger if we act together. And in the energy mix, if I take the four countries that we are mainly discussing today, France, Germany, Switzerland, and Belgium, the the place of the nuclear energy and renewables is very different in all these four countries. So we need to find an answer to harmonize the situation. There are political realities in each country, but we need to find a way to iron them out. Well, I'm sure that we will come back to this. Thank you very much. Anna Karina Kolb, you are the director of the External and Federal Affairs Department in the state of Geneva. It is a cross-border living area. You manage projects for the last 20 years, I've been told. And so the challenges that you have on a daily basis, are they very different in relation, for example, to climate change and the urgency of the question? And does it require specific governance models? Uh, Good morning, everyone. Well, the ecological transition within the Greater Geneva area is an accelerator of cross-border cooperation. And this perimeter of Greater Geneva has been a focus for interdependencies, as was mentioned earlier. We've always been interdependent, and we have put in place innovative solutions to manage this common living area. And it started in previous centuries. Uh, in the 1970s, we also set up bodies so that we may be able to discuss matters beyond the border, because in this cross-border living area, we belong to two countries that are organized completely differently, institutionally speaking, with the centralized the state in France, the very strong institutions, collectivities of transfers of competence, and Switzerland since 1848 on our side certainly has not moved institutionally speaking. And so we need to be able, nevertheless, to speak to each other um, between the complexity of the situation in France with it's more like a salami in Switzerland with 26 cantons. So we try to be practical. We try to manage the living area characterized by the management of an environment and of our region with a lake and river and mountain chains that force us to work collectively. So since 1950, we set up a funding tool for financial compensation, without which we would not have been able to develop together. And with bilateral agreements, we talked about the European framework. The European framework in 2000 was in better health in terms of the discussions between Switzerland and Europe. And those agreements stimulate flows that are enormous. We've talked about different flows. There are approximately 130,000 people who cross the border coming out of Geneva into Geneva every day to work in Geneva. So we manage all these people, and this has been accelerated with our bilateral agreements and the effects of the economic growth, which is very positive, of course, for us, but which have negative effects in terms of land management, land planning leads to great imbalances that was spoken of this morning. So it is important to be able to manage these imbalances. And in this decade, the issues of urban areas, well, in the Greater Geneva, we have an ad hoc governance which is appropriate to our region, with our teams, resources, with a legal framework which is an ad hoc framework to find answers to these new problems, to find answers and a much more localized management, which is available to us now. And the ecological transition currently has an available structure of cooperation and that we adapt depending on the needs. The ecological transition is an accelerator. It means that we have to move forward much more quickly. It's for the Greater Geneva essential. So everything that we do in the Greater Geneva is linked to this transition at all levels: land planning, environmental projects, mobility, of course, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, because there is one thing that is clear in Greater Geneva and in Geneva as a whole, is that ecological transition can only happen collectively, jointly, and in a cross-border fashion.
So you've tried to reel me in so I can ask the same question. We've spoken together as we prepared the example of Area, the Express, to illustrate these challenges across the organization. We've got a project which is not just planning, it's a concrete project which is part of the area. We can imagine the complexity of this project, but it's up to you now to tell us the difficulties in organization of such a project and how you overcame them. So the Aimant Express X, as we call it, Lex, as we call it, is the emblem of a new paradigm, a new mobility paradigm in our area. It's the future Lex. No, it's currently being rolled out. It's an emblem. It's a matter of overcoming the obstacles one after the other without necessarily knowing beforehand that we were going to have all of these obstacles. So to mention some of them, of course, there were financial obstacles. We needed to find finance. These are linked to projects both on the French side, financed it on the French side and on the Swiss side, with a specific desire to receive capital from the Bern canton in terms of finance. The seek for funding obviously went beyond just rails and carriages, because when we're speaking about new infrastructure, we're talking about operating costs as well. So we're seeking finance costs to finance the operating loss. Lex is 60,000 people transported per day, which is beyond the forecasts we had before COVID. So there is a density, and we need to be able to carry that beyond the center of Geneva to the more distant lines, and we are working to do that at the moment. So what was the organization? What structure manages this? How did you manage this from a partnership point of view? The problem was that the financial authorities and the organizing authorities are not the same ones. We've got the region, Rhône-Alpes from the French side, with the Federal Transport Office, and the cantons in the Swiss side, with two national systems, with cultures, different cultures, national pride and national Spüler Alstom, for example. Note that when a train broke down, to begin with, to give you an example, what we were doing with a broken train was not the same as we do when we work on it as a part of the SNCF or the CFF in Switzerland. So this was not something we knew because it was the first time we had an international local railway on a European level. In 3 minutes, something can happen. There's a tunnel. The problems also are linked to safety. When there is vandalism on one side of the border, 3 minutes later on the opposite side of the border. So what do you do in terms of images that are filmed? So you've got images which are not protected in the same way in France and in Switzerland. We need to bring together some of the elements that I am describing are still being defined. We're talking about management structures. We have got a structure between CFF and the SNCF. So now we need to have a legal vehicle to manage this over time, which we have not yet found. French law and Swiss law does not allow this yet, but we will manage to do so. We will need to invent a new vehicle, a new animal, if I can call it that, which will be hybrid, which will not be very sexy because that's what happens when we work across borders, but which will enable Lex to be managed over the long term. Will the networks give you solutions? You have players who manage the rail networks. Could they have a way to manage this which could interest you? We'll get back to this. Over to you two, Mr. Rottner, first of all. After hearing the different presentations, how would you implement the way that you work between private sector, industries, political players? First of all, I think that you must work together, but where will you go to find your ideas? I live the same thing on a daily basis. What strikes me is that we can bring Ukraine in within 3 weeks. We didn't do shortcuts. And does it not work? Okay. Yes, it works. Okay, another example. I've got a manufacturer of trains who came to see me the other day and said, I need to make trains for France, engines. I make exactly the same ones in Holland, but the difference between the two is that in France, I'm asked for 27 additional kilometers of cable in my driving units. French standard, 30% higher costs. So we come back to this daily basis where regulations, the use of images, signals, that every difference between our two countries, we need to move forwards to qualify this. Why, along the borders between our countries, cannot we not make permanent shortcuts in terms of innovation, to have more innovation, more cooperation, to simplify life rather than making it more complicated, so that national law, our various national laws, to try to find consistency at all times. We've spoken about the Aix-la-Chapelle agreement earlier on, the German-French Assembly, which was set up for cooperation, but they need to meet so that when there is a marathon on both sides of the borders. In France, we ask for medical certificates. In Switzerland, they don't, but they're running the same distance. So why, at a given time, can't we trust the systems on either sides of the borders? I'm not talking about tariffs. I'm not talking about all of the different secondary difficulties. We want to go there. Today, we are really held back both by constraints of European constraints and national law constraints, which are difficult. But when we cooperate across borders, we manage to do so, as we have seen with the Lex, we've seen with the power of Luxembourg, moving from 8,000 to 23,000 passengers per hour with additional trains, with two levels of train. These are things that do not happen from one day to the next. We need to extend platforms. That takes time, that takes money. Whereas we have a financial cooperation system between our two governments. So, do you want to respond to? Yes, I'd like to add to what he has just said with a reflection from our point of view as an operator. Our operators are national with a policy which is national. Not always the case, it depends on the country, but a policy which is national. And as an operator, we are delighted to see a regional energy plan emerging, which is fundamental. It's fundamental because sometimes the advantages of the infrastructures that we need for the energy transition are benefits which concern a certain number of countries, but are not always seen locally, whereas the infrastructure itself is local. And that's a problem. Giving you an example on our France-Spain border, it is very difficult in terms of infrastructure because there's a significant advantage to something that is built with Portugal, but we can't see that locally. So today we can see a strong energy policy locally, which will enable us to find a real global interest for all of the authorities concerned, including the local authorities in the area. So to come back to what we were saying here about this, we need European energy regulations too. That's true, because otherwise it will be difficult to build what we need to build tomorrow. But what is important too is for this European regulation and national regulation to leave place for initiatives which are more local, a place where it isn't legislated for, except locally, a local context where local authorities and companies can find solutions, sometimes quickly, sometimes over the longer term. And I think that there is a real space to move towards this to enable not just to be more effective, more intelligent and cheaper, but also to join to join the local populations, because the greatest limits what we have in terms of energy is to reconcile general interest, general use with local interest. And this space is also for governance. You're talking about agility, and agility depends on the subjects and the environmental transition. We can invent systems rather than imposing them. Sorry, about governance, I'll come back to this. Sometimes it can be bilateral, sometimes it can be multilateral. Today, we are working Benelux, which is an interesting area. Why? Because in Benelux, in terms of hydrogen, in terms of offshore, there's very interesting things which are happening. Should we ignore them? No. We should rather consider cooperation, but it is also a way to go to Brussels, to Strasbourg, to Luxembourg, to our European bodies to say, we've thought about this. We're not just a small region, we're coming together with experts in energy, with politicians, with the residents and users. And it is a part of Europe which is moving to ask you to act in this area to find consistency on an energy project. Okay, this governance, is it ad hoc or is it intelligence to discuss opportunities which can be built for the future through this transition? That's very clear. So what we can do on an ad hoc basis, Madame Kolb, in terms of the capabilities of decision makers, is there a problem? How is this organized? You said you have a unique example for the cross-border transport where there was there was organization, you were working together, but the decisions are then taken on both sides by the states, by the deciders, with decision makers, which is not the case for your organization, where you have the power to decide. You have a legal mandate to decide within a certain field of action. I think field of action is the word. When you talk about cross-border engineering, you have to work on an ad hoc basis. You have local needs. We try to take advantage of national and European frameworks. We continue to make demands, but across borders, thus far, either you have a very limited operational body taking decisions, or there are bodies which bring together elected representatives where each representative comes with their own decision-making powers which they validate or can have validated, except in some operational areas. And in the case of the Greater Geneva area, one body requires to have a delegation of skills which corresponds to this hydroelectric network, which is a high mountain transit system, which is under French law for questions of safety and of management. So coming back to the need to have a relationship with local and national requirements, the idea is not to provide a ready-made context, but to leave us the freedom that we need. There are moments when we need to have national regulations, international regulations, for example, with remote working now, because we've spoken about flows of people, we've spoken about binational answers. But other than that, the question is to understand whether we can make this go further. The other thing across the region is the sticker that you have in France, and it is clear that there's no reason to have different stickers on cars during peaks of pollution. So Geneva decided to take the example of this sticker, noting that pollution peaks are not the same in France and Switzerland. Otherwise, it would not be a good thing. So we have a different organization. The Interreg project works on standards, which was then taken up by Geneva using the French stickers to have a single sticker. And then France needed to recognize Swiss stickers based on the French model. And that has just happened. The minister has given the green light. Thank you very much. And in fact, we have solutions which are regional, which are ad hoc, which push the border back, but that makes things consistent for citizens in terms of our response to pollution peaks. I think I'd also hear from the room, if you could lower the lights a bit, I can see these people, and also maybe first of all people in the room, and then we can go to Slido. Slido will display if other people wish to ask questions. I can see much better now. Since yesterday, we said we need examples, first-hand accounts. If the discussions which have happened over the long term, do you have reactions? Do you have questions? We'd also, you could introduce yourselves too. To take the floor, sir. Will there be other people here who we can see? I'll have a look on Slido then. Can you hear me? Yes. Hello. Arnaud Duges, work at Lausanne University. A question from Mrs. Kolb. You said it a little earlier. The framework agreements between Switzerland and the European Union are stopped. I'd like to know about the Canton of Geneva. What is your vision about what's next? Are there strategies at a canton level that you would like to put in place to overcome this problem? Or would it be more a case of lobbying in Bern to restart these framework agreements or to extend bilateral agreements in another legal form? Thank you very much, Mrs. Kolb. So the strategy is difficult because we need to have these agreements there, framework agreements, which are vital for Switzerland, which also break down across the region. And the negotiations at an international level between the Confederation and the European Union are essential and cannot be avoided. This being so, we have very active cross-border relations. We share our needs. The Geneva Canton lobbies actively with the federal bodies to express their needs, and the need for the agreements, the framework agreements, which are the framework for our relations with France in particular. And we hope we will be able to make progress because it is something which represents over time a great danger for Switzerland and for the region. Are there any other requests? Maybe you are also the ones asking questions on Slido. I can't see you very clearly. We're lucky that we're face to face. If you are asking questions in the room, I will hand over to you. Over to you, sir.
Yes, I've got a question to the Swiss representative. So apart from the EU framework agreement, you've got an energy agreement between the Swiss, and that has been stopped. So how would you evaluate the energy safety in Switzerland in the next winter? Because we have the problem that Swiss is a transit country.
How can Switzerland ensure energy security for next winter? You just have to look at that association there, and I hope that that will be possible. Yes, if I could add more information. The absence of a framework agreement is a problem. It's a problem for Switzerland, but also for the rest of the continent. Today, this absence is a real problem, including in our association. That's the political problem I was speaking about earlier, but it's a problem where we are looking for technical solutions. And for our role is to remind the politicians in Switzerland and Brussels, for example, that this winter there is a specific problem with Russian gas, and there is a danger of having problems of supply across the European continent. And Swiss resources and German resources are very complementary. So it would be a great shame for Switzerland, but not just for Switzerland, not to have the cooperative tools for this winter, which would enable us to have a much better security for energy in particular. The more you are connected, the wider the network is, the safer you are. And this is a principle which we see our role as to remind the decision makers that the citizens' internet underpins this, and we need to take that into account. Note that Switzerland is in the center. 41 networks are linked, and so there's a whole for Switzerland and for the entire continent. And having an agreement on electricity is a significant difficulty for us currently during this vacuum in terms of negotiations with the European Union on research and innovation too. That is how we are living it most importantly. So discussions are underway regarding next winter. I hope that we will find solutions, at least when the players want, as you said. We hope we will find solutions. There were several questions about energy. Since we just have 3 minutes left, maybe I will ask Mr. Rottner a question about the utility of Article 13 of the Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty, which speaks about exceptional circumstances if a state on one side wishes to have specific governance. I'm not a specialist in Article 13. I don't know it. No, I don't know it. So I might say something wrong. So maybe somebody else could ask the question. Could somebody else remind us? Earlier on, there was a question. No. Okay. Well, we'll look at this later. Go ahead. So, did you ask the question? Okay, go ahead. Hold on. Microphone, please. It's nice to have direct interaction.
Region Grand Est, denn die Experimentierklausel.
Because there is a clause regarding experimentation in the Treaty of Aachen, and the goal is a simplification of the relation between Switzerland and France? Because Switzerland is not a member of the Treaty of Aachen. And how can the Région Grand Est, the Article 13.2, this experimental clause, use it together with Germany to achieve solutions which was possible with Switzerland without having the Treaty of Aachen?
J'ai rencontré dernièrement
Recently, I met Minister Kachman, who was visiting, and we are very impatient to see these negotiations between Europe and Switzerland resumed intensely to enable us to undertake negotiations. Whether there were negotiations in Geneva, for example, but also between universities in Basel, in Freiburg, Mulhouse, Strasbourg, a university with specific legal status at UCOR, where we are interested in the Swiss participation, and Europe should not be considering Switzerland as a separate enclave, but a dynamic part which must be included in a design of a Europe of energy, a Europe of knowledge, a Europe of economy. How can we imagine European corridors across Europe, freight corridors, which could not cross Switzerland, for example, to reach Genoa, for example? All of that requires decisions, framework decisions on a European context, a national context. So we are reaching the end of this session. I'd like to ask a question quickly to each of you. It's a huge subject, but all of this governance facing climate matters with strategic questions which need to be considered, structural questions, and so it's a question, a democratic question. Either you are decision makers in one way, or you are elected representatives, or you choose you are representing a cross-border area. What is the democratic place for citizens in this? You need to hear things on strategic choices that you decide across borders. It's a huge subject. So quickly, what would you say about this question? I don't know. It's a question of it, this a subject in its own right. This question of cross borders. When a train doesn't work between two countries, it doesn't matter whether it's Luxembourg or France. I was thinking more about planning. Yes, but daily life planning with citizens starts with what people want on a daily basis. When borders are closed, if there's a crisis, as we have seen, it is citizens who notice that it is something abnormal. And of course, they need to work with us on strategic choices, social responsibility, environmental responsibility, which is based on policies, on citizens. I think that Europe today across borders will only work if local authorities. What does this mean? It means moving together. It means having a project. When you have a project, we don't necessarily need to protect just one category, but we need to make a compromise, and cross-border means compromise. Mr. Cortinas, it's a more complicated question for you, but do you expect states, Europe, for example, to provide information which would help you? Yes, of course. We can't approach this unless all of us citizens are in favor. I think the key word is compromise. In energy, you have advantages for large authorities. You have local impacts, though, and compromise is fundamental. Compromise cannot be made without a democratic choice. It's more than energy. It's about general interest. Okay, so in terms of transport infrastructures, for example, all of these needs which will change our behaviors, change our cultures. Yes, I think from a point of view of citizens, the services provided, they're interested in having a result available in the regions where we move freely and where we want to continue to move freely. And secondly, this will enable citizens to understand what is happening in terms of problems of a general interest and compromises between different systems. It's very complex, very quickly. When we are talking about cross-border cooperation, we need to invest to see how this works. So enabling citizens to understand is a challenge. And when I say it's not democratic, I say that the decisions taken are in fact taken following democratic processes. There are no decisions made on in an authoritarian basis across borders. So it's not a question of the Swiss meaning of the word democracy, but it's a question of democracy informing citizens to follow with an increased awareness to take part in debates and influence where they can. Thank you very much to all three of you. I hope that you have a better understanding. I hope you have had answers to your questions. So let us thank them.